Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care. Yeah.
Good evening and welcome to Healing Moments, the interactive program every Thursday at 6 p.m. I hope you told a friend that we are on. Now, this week, we are dealing with coping with grief and loss. Last month, our topic was acts of service. Now, I remember I told you last week that this week we will be having a special guest in. But before we go to that special guest, as always, let us start with a word of prayer and go into our spiritual aspect of the program.
Good evening, everybody. This evening, we'll be looking, as Kathy said, at something that has affected, I believe, each and every one of us. I'm thinking of grief. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we know from your word that sin is an intruder. And when it came into our lives, it brought many things that you did not ordain for us, among which is grief. You yourself suffered grief when your son died as a result of being salvific for us. And we want to thank you for that. We have a Savior who can identify with us because he went through the things that we went through. So when we are having grief, we know that our God hears, you know how God understands. This evening, we are asking you to come to all those homes where individuals are suffering grief. We know not the cause, but grief is painful. But we know that you can mend a broken heart. You can take care of grief. So we're giving every situation that is causing grief to individuals this evening to you, knowing that you can and you will take care of those circumstances. Thank you for hearing our prayer. For Christ's sake, amen. Our devotional feature this evening is written by Sylvia Jacobson. She had an unusual experience which caused her much grief, and I thought I would share it with you this evening as we look into this topic of grief. Our scriptural text is Revelation 21:4, the New International Version, and it reads, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." This is a promise that the Revelator wrote as to how God is going to deal with all the pain and difficulty that we have. Let's go in now to Sylvia Jacobson's story. And this is what she writes, and I read, "The door burst open as Eric, panic-stricken screams shattered the calmness of the Thursday afternoon. 'Mama, come quickly. Richard's dying.' Eric did not wait for any response from me, but quickly turned around and headed back into the orchard. I followed closely behind him. As we moved deeper into the orchard, I called after him, 'Eric, what happened?' 'Richard fell off the tractor and it ran over him.' 'No, Lord, not this way,' I prayed as I stopped, struck by the words Eric had said. 'Lord, give me peace. Help me to know what to do.' In a moment, I was beside Richard." Sylvia continues, "As we were waiting for the paramedics to arrive, 7-year-old Richard in a calm voice said, 'Mama, am I going to die?' As I prayed for the wisdom to respond, strength and courage welled up inside of me as God spoke. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Hebrews 13:5 came to mind. Bending over his small boyish frame, I asked, Richard, you love Jesus, don't you? Yes, Mama, I do, he said. You know Jesus loves you, Richard, don't you? I asked. Yes, Mama, he loves me. I began praying aloud for healing and God's mercy. The child repeated after me, I'm sorry, Jesus, for all the wrong I ever did. Peace and tranquility engulfed my son and me as we prayed there in the orchard. Never again would he speak after that heart-searching dialogue with me. By faith, my husband came, and I knew that Richard's prayer was heard and answered by Jesus, that all his sins were forgiven. We now know that Richard's sleep rested in the arms of Jesus, and yet that does not take away the physical, mental, and emotional pain of missing him from day to day. And that is the beauty of a loving God who is willing to physically hold us in his arms and wipe away all our tears while we are hurting and suffering. One day, there will be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. Oh, what a blessed hope to look forward to. Friends, can you feel God's hand holding you in his arms? If you can, he'll carry you over grief and pain and will never leave you nor forsake you. Hold on to that promise. So I'm saying to you this evening, whatever grief you might be facing, you're not in it alone. God cannot lie. He's not a man, the Bible says, that he can lie. So if God says he will never leave you nor forsake you, he means what he said. And he's not going to leave us alone. He goes through it with us. So through the grief and through the pain, God is our constant companion. So my last words to you this evening on this particular dialogue is that you give God first place in your life. Give him your grief. He said, come on to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And that rest includes rest on carrying the baggage of grief. May God bless you.
Thank you so much, Trevor. As you say, God says he will never leave us nor forsake us. Before I introduce our special guest this evening, I want to say a very warm welcome to each of you joining us here on Zoom, and those of you who are on YouTube. Welcome to Healing Moments. If you're joining us for the first time, I pray it would not be your last. Now, remember, after Dr. Dupree comes, you have your chance to ask your questions. Remember to type your questions in the chat, and the questions will be asked for you. Those of you on YouTube, you can type your questions in the chat box and we will see them and they can be asked as well. Now, our special guest this afternoon is Mrs. Shawna Carter. Shawna is a counseling psychologist who has served in the field of guidance and counseling for over 20 years. Shawna is presently the guidance officer at Samuel Jackman Prescott Institute of Technology. Shawna is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Cave-Hill campus, and holds a Master of Science degree in Counseling Psychology. She recently completed postgraduate certification in loss, grief, and trauma management. Ladies, I want you to welcome Shawna Carter.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon to share in this session. And I trust that as we speak together, that we'll be able to learn from each other on the issue of loss and grief. Now, today I'm going to be sharing with you an introduction to the topic of loss and grief. And I know that during the course of this month, you will be focusing on this topic. And therefore, I'm just going to be giving you an introduction today. And hopefully the questions that you ask would bring some clarity to you. And during the course of the month, you will get to expand on this topic. So we're looking today at loss and grief. And as I said, I want to thank you for the invitation. And I just want to say that I found over the course of my professional career that the issue of loss and grief has always been a challenging area. Sometimes when students were sent to me with regards to their own experiences with loss and grief, sometimes it was a little overwhelming at times, but I found that over the years I've done some reading, and as the introduction said, recently completed a course in loss, grief, and trauma management. And I found a more holistic way of dealing with the topic. And I hope that as we explore today, we would learn some new things, or at least consolidate things that we knew already. So in our presentation today, I'm going to be sharing with you a few key definitions surrounding grief, and then we're going to look at the issue of normal grief. Okay. So I captioned this slide. Here's the thing. So I want us all to recognize that we've all been touched by loss. Whether you recognize it or not, there are some losses that are death related, and there are also losses that are non-death related. We often think about loss with regards to persons who have died, but in actuality, lots of the losses that we encounter are non-death related. If we think about a job that you would have lost, a broken relationship, a business that folded and did not work out. Even for students who are at school, you failed a major exam, or you have a good friend or a parent who's moved away or who's gone to live overseas. Those are all losses. And then for couples who may suffer a miscarriage or may be infertile and can't have children, or for some reason you have lost a limb or lost a part of your body, these are all examples of losses. And even within the context of COVID-19, there is also a number of there are also a number of losses that we have encountered, even losses of our freedoms. We often, even in these times, have lost our certain freedoms that we were accustomed to, certain restrictions, so that these are things that create losses for us as well. So we may not always recognize that we are grieving. We may not always recognize or see that a loss has occurred. But generally, when we are faced with a loss, and I've given some examples, we cope with them as best as we know how. Sometimes we utilize positive coping mechanisms. Sometimes we utilize negative ones. But basically, we pull on what we know. Some persons may turn to alcohol, for instance. That may not be you, or they may abuse some type of substance, or they may get angry and withdrawn. For children, you may find that they may act out at school, or their performance in their schoolwork may decline. These are all responses to losses that we may face, and some of them may be in a negative way of dealing with it. There are some positive ways as well. And we can talk about that as we go on. But basically, when we've encountered a loss, something major has happened in our lives, our world has changed, and sometimes we don't know what to do. Every culture has common rituals that are attached to death-related losses, because as I said, most of the time, that's what we think about when we're thinking about losses. But in actuality, grieving is unique to every individual. You may grieve differently from I would. The way how it looks for me may be different for you. The length of time it takes and the intensity of it may vary from person to person. But as Brother Trevor would have said in his devotion, God is with us in all of our experiences and also in our grief. And on every slide, I've included a text of encouragement. But I want to say here, and this is not included in this presentation, but oftentimes when persons suffer a loss because of death, sometimes we as good Bible students pull out some text from the Bible and try to encourage persons. But sometimes those texts at the point in time when it happens are not as comforting as we think they are. And sometimes we have to be careful the things that we say. Of course, with time, they will be encouraging, but sometimes at the point of death, they're not so encouraging. So that's just a little plug to remind us that we have to be careful about the things that we say. So let's look at a few definitions. 4 words I want to define so that we're clear as to what these things are. So first of all, a loss. A loss basically is the removal of something that we deem meaningful. And that thing, or I said thing here, but it could be a person, it could be a thing. And that loss can be real or it can be perceived. It can be something that we can actually see or is tangible, but it could be also something that carries a meaning for the thing that we've lost or the person that we've lost. So for instance, we may lose a job, for instance, and because of that loss of a job, it means we've lost some of a sense of identity, or sometimes our status in our community, as it were. So that the real loss would be the loss of the job, but then there are other perceived losses or other secondary losses that go along with the major loss that we would have experienced. So loss is basically the disappearance of something that we cherish, whether it's a person or an object. And as I said, sometimes it may be death related, sometimes it may not be so. Even something as commonplace as retirement sometimes can bring on reactions similar to that of grief. When we grieve for a person who has died, those are some that can also bring on some of those reactions as well. So then what is grief? Grief now is the normal and natural reaction to a loss of any kind. So with grief, we suffer a loss, and the things that happen to us naturally, normally, we describe them as grief. Sometimes there are typical responses. They can both be in the mind, mental, as well as physical in our bodies, and we can see those effects in the way how we perform in our daily lives. We can see those effects. Oftentimes it occurs in a systematic manner and can occur before or after the loss. But of course, as I said before, there's no one way to grieve, and therefore it may be different for different persons. Bereavement now is a state of an individual who has recently experienced the death of a significant person. So someone who is bereaved would have recently lost a significant person, and I also would want to include the other types of losses that I would have mentioned. But most of the time we associate bereavement with the loss of an individual or person. And then mourning would be those social and cultural acts through which grief is expressed. So oftentimes, for instance, we are familiar with the wearing of black or the wearing of dark colored clothing when someone has lost someone. And that is one of the acts that persons often associate with mourning, and sometimes even to the extent that persons count it as disrespectful if someone wears a color that does not represent mourning per se. That is changing because sometimes at funerals in more recent times, persons actually request that you not wear mourning colors. But that is something that has been traditional and is accepted as a form of mourning. So those are some definitions. Now I want to look at what is normal grief. And you would see the term normal grief. So you might ask then, is there abnormal grief? But today I'm only focusing on the normal grief. Outside of normal grief, we may have complicated grief, but I'm only focusing on the normal grief today. So grief is a process. And by process, I mean it does not necessarily have a set way of happening, and it is not necessarily a one off thing, but it is a process. It's something that happens over time. There's no set time for one to be grieving, but it is generally felt that persons would return to their normal activities within about 6 to 12 months. So 6 months to a year, it is often associated with the normal grieving process. But of course, different things for different persons. Grief generally occurs in waves, in fits and starts. So at one day you may feel extremely sad and be crying, can't get out of bed, feeling really down. And then maybe other times when you can actually smile or laugh because you remember something that the individual may have done or may have said, or because of some memory that you may have, you may still be able to share a moment with some person else that does not demonstrate the deep anguish that you're feeling because of the loss. So at times, as I said, there are barely noticeable changes. For some persons, you look at them and you say, are they really grieving? They're not crying. They're not looking extremely sad, but different things for different persons. But sometimes they're noticeable changes. Sometimes their persons are in deep anguish and can't do what they need to do on a daily basis as they normally would. There are two forms of grief. There's acute grief, which is what happens as soon as the death, in this case, because that's what we're talking about in this case, has occurred. We have acute grief. And then as time moves on, we go into the phase of integrated or abiding grief, not when the grief has disappeared, but we are now better able to manage the loss of that loved one. But always remember that grief is a personal journey. Everyone grieves in their own way. And this is influenced by our personality, our resources, our supports, and also the relationship that we would have had with the person. And it would also add here, it also depends on how the person's death would have taken place, or if we're talking about another type of loss, how that loss would have occurred will also affect how quickly we're able to move forward in our grief. Part of normal grief also includes finding new and meaningful ways to continue the relationship with the deceased, not meaning that the person has not died, but that we find ways to keep connected. So some persons may hold on to an item of clothing that belongs to the person, or they may set up a fund in the person's name, or we find some way to memorialize the person that we would have died or would have lost, So that's all parts of the normal grief process. So there are different theories surrounding how grief goes, but this particular one I find is very simple, and I like it because it's easy to understand. And I've used this circle of arrows to remind us that grief is not linear. It can go around in circles. Sometimes we start at one point, we move forward, we go back, because that's just the nature of grief. So 3 phases I want to share with you. First of all, there's a shock and denial. So you've just heard the news and you are in a state of shock. You are feeling numb. You can't believe that this thing has happened. You feel almost a sense of helplessness, confusion. You're not sure what to do. That's the beginning stages. And this can last for a few hours to a number of weeks. And again, the intensity of it, how long it lasts, depends on the circumstances surrounding the loss. Was it a sudden death or a sudden loss, or was it something that you anticipated? Do you have supports from your family and friends? That sometimes can help you in getting past this first stage. But interestingly enough, persons have said that this first stage may have been a way how God has created our bodies so that the shock of losing someone does not have as much an impact on us in that initial stages or in that initial stage as it could. So it almost serves as a buffer, allowing you to kind of gradually come to the point of understanding and accepting that the person is lost, or you've lost that person, until you can now move on to the next stage. Second stage is actually experiencing the grief. And experiencing the grief means that we allow ourselves to grieve. Sometimes some persons shut down and they don't want to deal with it, but dealing with it allows us to get past it or to get through it. And we have to experience it in order to get through it. So we move then from those cold and sweaty hands that we may find in the shock and denial stage to experiencing the grief. Now, during that first stage, we may be planning for the funeral, we may be getting things together. And then we oftentimes have a lot of friends and family who come over and help us during that initial stage. But then sometimes at the funeral, that sometimes is the turning point. And then some of our supporters and friends may not be as close or not be as consistent in coming over as they would have before. And you're left alone to go through remembering this person, remembering things they would have done, replaying the death in your mind, and so on. And this second stage is characterized with anxiety sometimes, crying, sometimes there's anger at the person who has died, anger sometimes even if a person has died in the hospital, for instance, and you may have figured that the medical team did not do all that they should have, that they could have done. You feel anger towards them. You may feel guilt sometimes. Why did that person die and not me? What could I have done differently? Or sometimes there may be challenges in the relationship that you had prior to the loss. And now, because you were not able to resolve those challenges, you feel a sense of guilt. And during this stage, it is normal to forget that the person is gone and you still are looking for them to come home, or you're looking for them to call you on the phone, or when you're walking the street, you're looking to see if you see them. That's quite normal. And then the third phase is resolution. At this point, the pain does not disappear, but things change to the point that the intense sadness eases and you're able to talk about the person without breaking down. But sometimes things like anniversaries of the death or birthdays or special days are difficult to deal with. But during this stage, you're readjusting your life. And this is why I spoke about the abiding or integrated grief. When you're adjusting your life and rearranging it so that now you can move on without the person you've lost. I will soon be wrapping up. This next slide just shows you some of the symptoms that I would have just mentioned. Their physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, as well as behavioral symptoms, things that often happen during normal grief. And finally, I want to share with you a quote that I found to be very interesting. It says, "You will never get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to." And that's where I would bring this section to a close. Thank you.
Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care. Yeah.
I want to thank Shauna for that inspiring and inspirational talk on grief and the psychological aspects of grief and loss. Before Dr. Dupree comes, I want you all to remember to type your questions in the chat. Those of you who are on Zoom and on YouTube, please remember to type your questions in the chat and we will allow one of the panelists to answer them for you. I want to introduce Dr. Dupree now, who is going to come and give you the health aspect of our program.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. Right, so I'm gonna talk a little about the neurobiology of loss. And when we lose someone or something, the body releases the fight or flight hormone. And if you've been listening over the past few weeks, I'm sure you would now be acquainted with the fight or flight hormone. But the fight or flight hormone, one of them is cortisol, and that is released when you go through an acute loss. And every day, when you're reminded of that loss, that process occurs again. The hormones are released again. And I will show you in a while as a reminder where the hormone is released from. So that hormone is released again. And in the past, we also talked about plasticity of the brain and how the brain forms neural pathways by repeated actions. So when this hormone is released again in the brain over and over, you will find that there are new pathways forming in the brain. And the pathway that you usually take to form decisions, to the one that's involved in thought, for example, the brain is kind of turned upside down, and the decision-making part of your brain kind of takes a back seat. And the limbic system, which deals with emotion and is mostly sort of, what would we call it? The part of the brain that doesn't think much, that's just reactive, then that part takes over. This is a diagram to show you where the adrenal glands are. They sit just on top of the kidneys. And that's why sometimes even when we read the Bible, we see sometimes some things about the reins, as if it is the seat of emotion, but it isn't actually the seat of emotion. The adrenal glands are sitting just on top of the kidneys. And when there are times of stress, then the hypothalamus releases a hormone that acts on the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland releases a hormone that acts on the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland produces cortisol. So what is cortisol? We had talked about it before. It's a steroid hormone made by the adrenal glands, and it's important for regulating glucose, protein, lipid. It also suppresses the immune system and helps to maintain blood pressure. So that's the diagram that I mentioned before. The hypothalamus releasing corticotropin releasing hormone, acting on the pituitary gland, which releases adrenocortical hormone or adrenocorticotropic hormone that acts on the adrenal glands to release cortisol. So the cortisol now causes increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, increased blood glucose. So you get energy to do the things that need to be done. And it also suppresses functions that are not important to life. So for example, the gastric and intestinal muscles, they relax, and you find that you can't digest your food. And sometimes there is even a loss of control of functions like bladder function and intestinal function, because you need that energy to react. So it's either fight or flight, but in some people it's freeze as well. Right. Again, this is just a diagram that lists all the effects of cortisol. Some are considered good, some may be helpful, like heightened memory and attention. Increasing blood pressure may be helpful momentarily, but you can see that if you remain in that state of stress, or if you don't learn to deal with your grief or your loss, then it can lead to a permanent increase in blood pressure, which of course will become a problem. People who suffer acute losses and go through loss of a loved one tend to have higher blood pressures in the short term than others. But it can also suppress the immune system, which isn't good, especially in times of a pandemic. You don't want to be dealing with too much cortisol from the adrenal gland, because you're going to need your immune system to fight diseases. So people who are mourning tend to, or people who are grieving, tend to suffer from infections at an increased rate. There's also a decrease in serotonin, and we had talked about serotonin multiple times. Serotonin is one of the feel-good hormones. So it makes you feel less good or less happy, less relaxed. And it also increases blood sugar, which may be a useful thing, but as well, if it is prolonged, may become a dangerous thing. Again, this is a list. Blood flow to the muscles increase, because in times of fight or flight, you may need the energy. The heart rate increases, intestinal muscles relax, the pupils dilate, breathing increases, blood sugar level increases, and blood pressure. This shows regions of the brains that are that are affected by grief. So in the prefrontal cortex, which is where you're going to be doing all your thinking, activity there is decreased. And then you have the anterior cingulate cortex that deals with emotional regulation. That part may become underactive. And the overactive part is the amygdala, which deals with fear responses, and that kind of action. that part of the brain is going to be overactive. And instead of thinking clearly, you will be doing more reaction, feeling afraid. And that just, again, is a diagram of the prefrontal cortex, PFC, anterior cingulate cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, the thalamus, which is part of the limbic system, and the parahippocampal gyrus, which is also part of the limbic system. And then we come to a very, very recently diagnosed, well, 30 years ago, yeah, recent, which is known as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy or stress cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome. You may have heard things like she died or he died of a broken heart, and you might just think that that was just a saying, but it's actually a physical ailment. It's physiologic, it's anatomical. It was named in 1990 by Japanese scientists. And there is a transient, meaning it can pass, it usually passes. Hypokinesis, meaning that there is decreased movement or movability, if you wish, of the left ventricular apex. And the apex of the heart becomes dilated, and they named it that way because it kind of looked like some kind of pot that they used to catch octopus or octopuses. Right. And that type of cardiomyopathy, and I've actually diagnosed it in a couple of dead people. It's not a very common diagnosis, but sometimes that is the only thing you're going to find that explains why the person died. It's associated with severe emotional or physical stress, such as happens in acute loss. And the main symptoms are chest pain and shortness of breath. And why that is very important is that it may easily be mistaken for a heart attack or myocardial infarction. And sometimes other symptoms are going to be palpitations, nausea, vomiting, fainting or syncope, and cardiogenic shock. Very, very closely resembling myocardial infarction. And there are even changes on the ECG because it is actually a physical problem that happens with the heart. It occurs most often in women, especially older women. And most of the time it goes away, it's transient. But there are times when it can lead to death. It is believed to be caused, my typo, sorry, by a sudden release of stress hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And remember, in the past, we said that adrenaline increases the heart rate and noradrenaline decreases the vessel capacity or vascular lumen of the arteries. So that causes pressure to go up. And that can actually result in death. So people do die of a broken heart. So grief and loss are very serious things. They're not just psychological, but they can lead to serious and permanent physical damage and even death. And I will stop there. I don't like talking about loss. We'll take your questions anytime. Stop share.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeVries, for your health aspect on grief and loss. Now is your time, you the participants, to ask any question that you want to ask pertaining to grief and loss as this evening. And first off, we have one question coming in the chat so far, and it says, could removing your womb or impotency in men be considered a loss?
Okay, that's a very interesting question and very important question as well. And the simple answer, the removal of your womb and impotency in men, yes, both can be considered losses. First of all, for a female, your womb is a part of your body, and therefore any loss of a part of your body is a loss, but also it represents especially if you hadn't had any children before. It represents a loss of opportunity to have children. And therefore, sometimes we often see having children as a natural and normal part of life. And therefore, if a woman is unable to have a child because of the loss of the womb, then that represents a loss as well. And this can be particularly difficult for some persons. For males now, in terms of impotency, men often equate maleness or their maleness with the ability of their sexual organs to function and function correctly. And I'm saying it that way, and I hope you understand clearly what I mean, because I'm assuming that there may be children here. So males often associate maleness with the ability of their sexual organs to function. And one of the ways that demonstrates that your sexual organs can function is your ability to to impregnate a woman and to have children. And therefore, not being able to have children is often devastating to both males and females, because for a man especially, you're not able to pass on your legacy, not able to have a relationship with their children, not able to pass on their name to somebody else. And then there's that loss of actually having the child to pass on what you know, what you've learned to another generation. And therefore that can represent a loss. And I would want to say that we have to be mindful of the struggles that persons face, especially with respect to impotency, infertility, and things related to the question that would have been asked. Sometimes in jest, we may say things to persons who may be childless, and we kind of make fun of them. When are you going to get a child? How come you don't have a child yet? Or whatever the case is. When in truth and in fact, sometimes persons are struggling with infertility and they are unable to have a child. So we must be sensitive to it. We don't always know what's going on in a person's life. But when we make statements like that, we sometimes add pain to the situation. So we must be mindful of that. So yes, impotency and the removal of the womb representing the inability to have children, yes, those represent losses.
I have two questions. I have a question coming in from YouTube, and this one says, it's coming from Jean, and it asks, is loss and grief experienced at all ages?
Yes, it can be experienced at all ages, but sometimes it may look differently to different ages. So a child, for instance, and I would have mentioned this in the presentation, a child, you may recognize the losses in the way how they function at school, for instance. They may be falling back on their work, they may be withdrawn and not wanting to play and associate with their friends. But as you go through the different developmental stages, it may look differently, but yes, loss can be experienced by all persons, yes.
Okay, we have another question coming in from YouTube, and this one asks from Marian Paris, and she says, every day I think about my only granddaughter who died. Sometimes I am sad, other times I think about her with a smile. Do you think I am still grieving over the loss of my only granddaughter?
But it would be difficult for me to say whether you're still grieving, but based on what I would have presented, it sounds to me as though you have reached a stage where you're able to think about her or reflect on her without necessarily being extremely sad and crying. Because when we think about loss, we don't ever recover from the loss. We find ways to move on without the physical person being there, but it doesn't go away. It just changes the way how your life is, and we find ways to manage our lives and to go on without the person being there. But it is helpful. It is It is good for you to still remember her because she was a major part of your life. And you said she was your only granddaughter. So yes, it is good to remember her. And it is good to have those fond memories of her. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with feeling that way towards your only granddaughter. That's quite fine.
Okay, this other question says, could dealing with erectile dysfunction be considered a loss?
But that would be closely tied to the matter of impotence in men. But yes, a similar answer would fit for that as well. Because again, as I said, men associate a great deal of their maleness to the functioning of their sexual organs. So erectile dysfunction, again, would represent their inability to impregnate a female, for instance, and then to function in a way that would be expected within a relationship. And therefore, that in itself, yes, will be a challenge. Yes, will be a loss. And it's something that would need to be dealt with not only physically, but also psychologically as well.
Okay, I have one coming from Zoom, and this one asks, is there such a thing as accumulated grief?
Accumulated grief, I would say yes. I know the term as compounded grief, where you may have experienced several incidents of loss, so that you're like, let's say you haven't recovered necessarily from one, but then another one comes, and sometimes again, because of how the loss takes place. If, for instance, we have someone who would have committed suicide or someone who was killed in a violent act, that sometimes can represent compounded grief. But with, I guess what the person is referring to with respect to accumulated grief, it is not having dealt with a situation of loss before. And then when a loss occurs, it triggers some of the past feelings that we may have had, past emotions that were associated with the past loss, and it creates a greater problem in the present because we never got to deal with the one in the past. So yes, it can occur. And again, and sometimes we often talk about going to a counselor or going to get help, but we individually can also be of support to each other as we try to help each other resolve the grief that we experience or the losses we experience.
Yes, Kathy, I'd like to come in here on the question of accumulated grief. The story of Job in the Bible is an instance where event after event after event came on him. So he got to the point that he said he wished he was not born. So eventually Job went to God and God dealt with it for him. But it can happen, and it does happen, and it can be very devastating if you do not have God to lean on.
But I would add there as well, it underscores the importance. Well, with Job, of course, the things were happening in quick succession, but it underscores the importance of experiencing the grief, each incident of grief as it happens, so that then that accumulation doesn't occur. But for Job, that would have been a peculiar situation where the things were happening so quickly that there was no time to recover, as it were, or to process it. But we need to be able, when grief occurs, not to stuff it, not to try to cover it up, not to ignore it, but to work through it and to process it so that that is not a reality for us in the future.
Okay, that's good, because someone asks, is there a timeline for grieving, and when should someone seek help?
Okay. I would have said in the presentation, normally it is expected that within 6 months to 12 months, a person would not get rid of the grief or the feelings that they would have had, but they're able now to return to normalcy, so to speak, normal functions, normal activities, go back to work and do the things that they would normally do. And if after that 12-year mark and persons are still so sad and as broken up as they were at the beginning, then it is at that time that you really should seek help. if you're not able to move past that. And then there are also other traumatic events, sometimes throughout the course of your life, that may create a challenge, so that if the person has experienced trauma, then that's a reason why person should seek help. If they're experiencing complicated grief, they should seek help as well, because then it means that something needs to be addressed. So generally 6 to 12 months. And if a person is still in that deep anguish and dysfunction as they would have been at the beginning, then for sure they need to seek some help.
Okay, we have a statement in the chat, and it says, in our attempts to be helpful to the person going through the grieving process, what are some of the things we should avoid saying, and what would be more appropriate supportive statements?
Well, it is funny that you asked that question, but I will share with you some of the things that we often say, and some that are not very helpful, and some of those things that we should indeed say. So sometimes we say things like, God knows best, God is in charge. At least the person is in a better place. They're no longer suffering. Sometimes we say there's a reason for everything. Or we say, you'll be okay after a while, time heals. So those are some of the things that we say. Somebody would say, stop crying. Or they would say, you could get another cat or another dog, or you can get another child. All of those things are not very helpful. Then we might say things like, cheer up, something good will come out of this. Those are not things that persons want to hear when they're struggling with grief. But here are some things that are more helpful. We could say, I'm so sorry for your loss. You could, sometimes we come up with this statement, I understand what you're going through, but indeed you cannot understand what somebody is experiencing. You may say to them, I wish I had the right words. Know that I care and I'm here for you, and then be prepared to listen to what they have to say and not to talk all the time. You could say to them, I can't imagine how you feel. You can tell them, I'm praying for you, and then follow up with actual prayer for them. I can't imagine how you feel. You might even want to share, well, how I felt when I lost a person, but don't make it about you, make it about them. And sometimes what you can do is to just be present. Sometimes the person does not want to hear anything, but be present. Sometimes there's not a problem with silence. Silence is not a problem. Sometimes we like to fill in the silence with words, and we want to talk all the time. But be caring, be compassionate, be there for the person. You can talk about the person who has passed away, if it is a death. Share a memory that you have of the person, and continue to connect with the person who is grieving, because sometimes we forget that the person is going through a difficulty and we move on, but that person is not moving on, and we have to try to continue connecting with that person. Be there for them, be present, even if it means just sitting and be quiet with them and keeping their company. But those are some of the things that we can say.
Reverend Lemon, do you want to give your last comments before we end?
Like I spoke earlier on the case of Job, we saw that in Job's instance, that God said to Satan, you cannot tempt him above that which he can bear. So even when we are going through a set of circumstance, God is always there. Satan cannot bring more upon any individual than he can bear. So you can take to mind that God is with you. He's going through it with you, and you're never left alone.
Professor Tree, you want to say anything?
Good night.
Dr. Dupree saying good night. We have a comment in the chat from Sherry Sobers, and she's saying, I'm glad you mentioned the loss of a pet, because that is also significant. Pets are like family. and their loss is also heart-wrenching for us. Well, that's all the time we have for Healing Moments. We want to thank you for joining us this evening. And remember, Healing Moments is on every Thursday at 6 p.m. Remember to tell a friend that Healing Moments is on. Before we go, I want to leave you with a quote. And this quote says, "Grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and the hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go." Thank you for joining us on Healing Moments this evening.
Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be loved. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be loved. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care.